Good evening. Please stand for the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, John.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. Welcome to the October 26th Planning Board meeting. First on the agenda is Liberty New York Water, 23 General MacArthur Drive, here for a public hearing. Mike?
This is on for public hearing. You left it open. I have no comments at this time.
There's no comments from Rich and Pat.
There are no comments from Rich and no comments from me. You have an approval resolution before you this evening.
Is there anyone from the public that wishes to be heard on this tonight?
If you don't mind, we do have some plan changes that I'd like to.
I was just giving the public an
Oh, I'm
opportunity
sorry,
first.
go ahead, yeah.
But yes, we would, I'm sorry.
Possibly after.
Okay, let's, yeah, please. Because
So,
last meeting, we had a couple questions for you and asked you to do a couple things.
Yes, so since the last meeting, we have actually, if you could see here, changed the tree species. We were proposing giant arborvitaes, and now we're proposing holly trees, which are deer-resistant, still evergreen, so they should still be in bloom all year round. And I know there were a lot of comments about the existing tank on the site, so what we've proposed are 12 holly trees to surround the tank on the, I think it's the north and west side of the tank, so hopefully that should provide enough screening. We were not able to paint the tank, just due to the make and model of the tank. It's a glass fused to steel tank, so there wasn't much we could do. What we did sort of look into was the tank roof vent, which I have a couple of photos. I wasn't able to print a large plan, but, okay, it's not a very good one, but I could pass these around also. The tank roof vent it's this large aluminum dome, and I think that's what is probably causing the most glare off the tank. And we have proposed to have that painted to match the tank. So in addition to the painting the vent and the screening, we feel that there's, enough coverage from the tank to hopefully prevent any glare and visibility of it.
Thank you for those actions. I just want to redirect it to the lady there. Would you like to, anyone from the public like to be heard on this?
Yeah.
Please, state your name, use the microphone.
Yeah, my name is Sandra Crone, 39 Colonel Glen Drive, Carmel, New York. All right, so you're talking about, oh, nice picture. You're talking about the tank. You can't do anything about the tank. So again, if you remember from the pictures that I gave you guys, the tank is shiny, even though it's got that paint on it. So I would hope that there would be another remedy as far as doing something to take away that glare.
May I ask do you know if the shininess is coming from the tank or from the dome?
It's coming from both.
Okay.
All right.
And one question, wouldn't the screening from the holly trees solve that issue?
I'm sorry, what?
Would the screening of the holly trees that
Yeah, but
was...
how long do holly trees take to grow? And what size are the how tall are the holly trees that are going to be planted going to take to get to a particular height? Or before I answer that question, what is the height of this tank from ground to the top? I don't know.
It's roughly 15 or 16 feet. So the holly trees that we're going to be planting are not mature. They are going to be 6 to 7 feet tall and should reach, hopefully, again, depending on rain and environmental conditions, 15 feet or a height to cover the tank in 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so for 3 to 5 years, we're going to be dealing with the situation where, again, like I said, some of the glare comes from the tank, as well as the crown on top. What do you call it? The
vent.
roof. What's that? What's the silver part called?
That's the vent of the
The
tank.
vent. Okay. So the vent is definitely very shiny, but also I noticed that the glare does come off some of the tank as well. And it depends on the time of day. Obviously, in the morning, not a problem, but as the sun sits up high and as it starts to come down, because the sun sets in the front of our house, and it's catching the front of the tank, and it reflects directly onto our deck and right into my kitchen window, where my sink is.
I mean, we really have limited space here, so we're trying to do the best we can to screen the tank from everyone's property. I mean, they could grow a little bit faster. I can't, guarantee anything, other than the fact that we are trying to plant some trees and dull down the tank as much as possible. But due to the make of the tank, it's not a paint that's on it, it's glass. The glass has a painting underneath it, and unless we deconstruct the entire tank, there's really no way to change the color of it.
So I would think that based on the fact that it's glass with paint underneath it, glass is smooth, and tends to be shiny, so that probably explains why there is some glare that's being caused by the sun on this part of the tank. I mean, I'm not an engineer and I don't have any knowledge or anything else in this kind of stuff, but, it's not a really good situation. And like I said, those pictures that I gave you in that booklet, you can see that the foliage is pretty strong, but they're coming down, and, that's not going to be covered again until the spring. So I don't know. I don't know how to solve it, but I would like to think that it could be addressed a little bit better.
Well, and that's why we're proposing the holly trees, because they will stay in full bloom all year round.
No,
They're
I
not
know, but
deciduous trees.
But it's going to take at least 3 years to get any results from that. See, I mean,
It should provide some coverage from it. I mean, it cannot cover the entire tank at this point. I mean, it's sort of not
Well-
possible to bring in a 50-foot tree.
No, I
a
know that.
15-foot tree, sorry.
well, if you look at this picture, all right, you can see that the shiny part there meets the top of the tank, or the roof. Actually, it's the roof.
It's the roof,
It's
which
the
is the
roof.
same construction as the side of the
Right,
tank.
okay. So if you look, I don't know, do you still have that booklet I gave you? The glare is where the sidewall of the tank meets the sloping part of the roof of the tank before it even gets to the vent. So it's shiny, and it's reflecting, the sun's reflecting off of there. So that's the tank itself. It's not going to be dulled. And the vent that she's talking about that they're going to paint, that also is shiny. That apparently can be solved, but this part is still going to be an issue.
You're
So-
going to paint the vent, correct? So below the vent is this part that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any way that you could put some type of screening up on top to cover that? A mesh screening, like a camo screening, or something like that?
We spoke to the manufacturer, and there's not really that many options other than, just painting the tank vent and putting screening up around it. It's just due to the nature of the construction of the tank.
So what I'm saying by screenings, I'm not talking about plantings, which I
Yeah,
appreciate
no,
what you
I
did.
understand.
think that's a great choice. I'm physically talking about on that side of the tank, erecting some posts and putting a screen,
Like a curtain.
like a curtain,
Certain.
something in a camo foliage pattern.
And then once the trees take, you could always take the screen down if they're covered.
Just another thought, another alternative to that is they propose screening adjacent to the tank. There's the other option to put screening closer to your home, theoretically, even on your property, if you gave them consent to place trees on your property.
Oh.
So that's another option to further mitigate the glare. If in
I
fact,
was also going to point out that this tank is at a lower elevation than your house is, so
Yeah.
putting trees as far back as we're showing it should hopefully, I mean, you might still see the top a little bit, but I don't have like a survey point with me to say that like you'd see it from your house
All
or
right,
not.
well, for a point of reference, this picture was taken on the deck. This is the railing of the deck. So I'm looking down at my backyard, and I'm looking kind of at an angle down towards the tank. So even if you planted trees, it's still not going to do anything at our property line. You know,
Oh, sure it would.
you
Sure
know,
it
what your
would.
idea
It
of
sounds like it would, right?
Yeah, sure it would, because the tank is below there.
The tank is below, so even if you look at the trees that we're proposing, they're not actually hugging the tank. They're slightly further back so that there is additional coverage. I mean, again, these are 7 or 6 foot trees, so it's not going to cover the whole thing, but it should hopefully cover, I don't know,
Yeah, the
8
thought being,
feet.
landscaping is a durable improvement once the screening takes. A wall or a fence or a screen, or Mike talked about some kind of sheathing on it, it's going to deteriorate over time, it's going to be a maintenance issue, and it's not permanent. The trees would be. So I think that's a good solution, and if there could be a second level of plantings closer to the property line or next to your deck, I think that would be a good, potentially a good solution. And by the way, the holly are deer resistant, it's a good choice.
sometimes.
They're poisonous, so that-
My
you,
neighbor-
you might have a problem if they eat it, but.
It would work. Yeah, Mike just pointed out, that if you chose 15-foot trees, they're more likely to fail.
Yeah.
Younger trees are more likely to take, but it takes a couple of years, so that's the trade-off.
And they actually grow faster than the larger trees.
What's the time frame as far as installing these trees?
We have to begin construction of the project, so I don't have a schedule for that yet because we don't have a contractor on board.
Okay.
So, look, I personally would be willing to meet you out there when you get ready to plant the trees, and maybe work with the resident and strategically plant them the best we can. Take a step back and look at them. If we need to plant some more, I could work with Mike and Pat on it, but I would be willing to do that. I think this is not insurmountable. I think, like Anthony said, there's been a good effort. We appreciate what you've done so far. And I think if we can't do it properly, well, properly is, how do you respond to properly, right? Then we can look at something Anthony said with hanging some kind of mesh. But let's work together on the landscape and see if we can remedy, because as Pat just said, the landscaping is forever,
Yeah,
right?
oh, definitely.
And they're committed to, if the tree dies in a year or two, which happens to all of us when we plant our own trees, they gotta replace it.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm willing to help out with that.
Okay, so the understanding is that when you get ready to do this, then you would let us know, and we would kind of like be around to be able to see what's going on.
What we would do is coordinate through Rose, that when you get ready to do it, I'll go out there with you and we'll schedule something with the homeowner. Rose has your name on file. And we'll come out and strategically place them with your input.
What's your timeframe on, because you say you're working with the other building?
Yeah, so
So what's your
the
guesstimate?
planting of the trees, we've included as part of the treatment plant project, is because we're also proposing to plant holly trees down there too. So the contractor's just going to be installing all the trees throughout the site.
So can I
I-
just interrupt that conversation? So, Mr. Chairman, now's the time to plant trees in the fall. So perhaps as a gesture of good faith, you could work to do this separate screening now, separate and apart from the treatment plant facility.
Do we have a time frame?
Please use the microphone.
Do we have a time frame from the landscape architect as to the best time to plant these?
Yeah, it's the fall. Now is the best time to plant,
Yeah, what's the end of that time frame though?
when you start to get
It's-
into the freeze.
Yeah, it's usually,
So, I mean,
I mean,
we
you might not
still,
even
we
be
still
able
need
to-
all approvals and bid and get the
So I'm
contractor on
suggesting
board.
that the tank is not really part of the treatment plant issue. It came up as a separate issue. So I'm suggesting, just as a good neighbor, if you could do this now, separate and apart from the treatment plant facility. Now, you may not be able to hit the window. Ordering the plants and getting them in before the freeze, it's tight. I don't know if you could do that. But I'm just suggesting that might be a good neighbor policy to extend that courtesy to your neighbors.
we can try to, as you mentioned, I'm not sure that we'd be able to get this in before, kind of first freeze. So this might be a spring activity that we're doing. But we can definitely try to work the best we can to get these planted this year. I can't guarantee that it will be before the first freeze.
Yeah, we wouldn't want you to plant them after the freeze and have them all die. That doesn't-
Oh, no,
Work
and
for
we
anybody.
wouldn't want to
Right.
do that either. I mean, I'm not a landscape architect, so I believe we have on the plans like the best time to plant the trees, and I think, you know, if we have to wait till the spring,
I'll say on our behalf that if we go back this week and we see an opportunity to make that happen and that quick turnaround, we'll lop it out of these plans and just do it separately. We'll look at that.
We can coordinate that through Rose, and we'll meet up.
Yep.
There's one other thing that, at the last meeting, you said there was a dead tree that was going to be removed by November 17th.
I think,
Yeah, operations has that planned.
Okay, I just want to
That's still
make
planned.
sure that's part of the record, that the tree will be removed on
Yes.
or about November 15th. The
From my understanding, nothing's changed from that.
No, the homeowners brought it up, I just want to make sure we follow up on it and it gets done. Okay, thank you. Anyone else wish to be heard on this tonight?
Hi, Jackie Calhoun, 25 General MacArthur. How many trees are going in the lower area where the treatment plant is?
11.
Can we and you also be present for that as well? Because that's
Yeah.
like literally in our backyard, so. okay.
And I do know at the last meeting you had talked about the fence, and I apologize because I should point this out. You shouldn't see the fence from here. The trees are outside of the fence line,
So you are doing a fence around the building?
yeah, for security purposes, we do have to do a fence around the building, but it's within the trees are screening it, so the trees are outside of the fence line, so you shouldn't see any of the fencing.
My husband and I were also wondering, because you're probably most likely going to do a black fence to match the other newer 2 fences, but there's a 4th fenced-in area that's metal. Could we possibly paint that one black to match the other ones? There's just so many fences going on back there. It just,
Do you,
do you know which one I mean? I have
I
a
don't
picture on
know.
my phone. The one on the right above where you want to build, it's a metal
probably well
fence.
3.
It's all like becoming big eyesore, especially from where we are. Different than their view, but there's just a lot of fences going on, and, I mean, we were just in the backyard today, just saying like, why can't this building go here? There was just so many other places, even between, right next to where the other building is, you can't go right there,
No,
because it is level. I was just there, we were
There's-
walking the dog.
that's not like accessible for this new building. That's why we had select the spot that we selected. I mean, we've screened it in as much as we can, and the building should not be, this building and the fence line should really not be visible from your house. And, you know, I think that we'd be willing to work with you as far as like the screening goes when we do end up putting the trees
What
there.
color fence are you gonna do?
Oh, I don't know.
Because the other two were black, and then one is metal, and the metal one shows a lot more than the black fences. Okay. So,
I'm assuming this fence will match whatever's existing on the other new building.
maybe we
And-
can look at the old fence, there's a big fence just around, what is that, Chad, like just a well cap? A big area for just like one little well cap in the ground, and that's all fenced in too.
Yeah, I know, again, for security reasons, these do have to be fenced in. I guess we'd have to look and see what well it is, because I'm not sure off the top of my head which one. I think I know which one you're talking about, because there's only really one right up gradient of there, but
Okay,
we'll have to look at that.
have to look at it.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, go ahead.
All right, just a question. Based on all this stuff we're talking about with particularly this tank and the trees and stuff like that, do we get a written confirmation of this and so that we can document
It'll
it?
be part of the record.
It'll be, all
That's
right.
why I even mentioned about that dead tree removal, so yes.
Okay. All right, so do we get a copy of that or not? Is this something that's
You can
available?
ask
Public
Rose,
record, yeah, you can get a copy.
you can talk to the planning board secretary, Rose.
Okay.
Call the
Yeah.
office.
All right, so she
I
would
don't
have,
think anything here is insurmountable about landscaping, I think that's.
yeah, I just want it for my records, that's all.
Of course.
And my second question is, do you notify us by mail when everybody is going to be doing this stuff, particularly for the tank?
We're gonna coordinate the landscaping through Rose's office.
And we get, we
That's
learn
what's
by
the
mail.
procedure for when
So there, no,
construction.
there is no procedure for this. We're winging it. So Rose will call you. You'll coordinate a time when Craig's available. That's what we're talking about here.
Okay, no, because sometimes we're not always in New York, so.
It'll be
Yeah.
a time that's convenient for everybody.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Anything else anyone else from the public wish to be heard?
Sorry, one more question. When will the trees at the bottom be planted? Is that also going to be the spring?
Well, that's part of the construction of the building, so we really can't plant those until the building and the fence are actually up. So that's gonna probably,
Landscaping and restoration is the last thing that's done on the project.
Okay. So we'll see the building and then the fence and then the trees will be about 6 feet, 6, 8 feet.
yeah,
Okay.
7 to
And the
6 feet.
building height again is 10?
16 feet? 16, yeah, to the roof ridge.
16, okay.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, being there's no further public comment, I'd like to make a motion to close the public hearing.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. I can stamp your drawing.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman, are you going to take action?
Yeah.
sorry.
Motion to adopt the site plan resolution?
Before we make that motion, Pat, do we need to incorporate what we discussed?
So
For-
all of
regarding
that's coming offline. So it would not be a condition of approval. It'll be reflected on an amended plan. You'll have to show us what landscaping you agree to, but it's not, it wouldn't be a condition of this approval. It's kind of a separate deal.
Then I'll
Which-
make a motion.
Which will be documented in our minutes. That's where we'll have some
The
control
record.
over this.
I'll make a motion to adopt the resolution.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Let me do that right here.
I second.
Second.
I should throw dollar bills back there.
Okay, next on the agenda is Greenpoint Tree Service, 6165 Old Route 6. Mike, I believe you had comments.
Yeah, the applicant proposes to merge two of the lots on Merriweather Estates. It was an old subdivision that was done years and years ago. Construct a commercial building consisting of 10 spaces that will be rented for heavy commercial use. The property is in the C Commercial Zoning District. Define heavy commercial. They literally wrote heavy commercial, but no definition of what they'll be doing there. The commercial zoning district allows fully enclosed establishment for the sale and repair of machinery and wholesale storage and distributive establishments, including lumber yards. If they can't fall into those two, they will need a use variance. Provide a floor plan and elevation. Will each space have an office, bathroom, break room? Consider this on the parking calculation. Offices require one parking spot per 200 square feet. You did the 1 per 1,000 across the board for everybody. So just make sure that we have those specific numbers.
Pat, I believe Rich had comments also.
He
Do you mind
does,
summarizing
and
them?
they're a lot. So Paul will give you the comments.
Well, there's several pages of typewritten comments, nothing,
That's normal.
yeah.
Well, it's a little more than normal.
First submission is normal.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have comments on this. So this site was before the board. There were a lot of issues with this property. It was fairly complicated. So what is being proposed now is that subdivision that Mike referenced. There are two lots in the middle that would be merged. So the first is that a merger has to occur. Meriwether Estates or those prior regrading applications, we need to research them to find out if there were any restrictions, limitations, conditions that are left over from those projects that we want to pay attention to, Paul. So I don't remember if there were, but if you can check your records, we'll check ours to see if there's anything lingering from those prior applications. There's a couple issues with respect to this. So Mike touched on it. The primary issue is what this is going to be used for. So a contractor's yard, we've had experience with these. They can be sloppy, messy, heavily used, not the best kind of use. It's not clearly the highest and best use of property, although a good, clean contractor's yard can be fine. We just can't tell yet from the plan that's been submitted. So a couple of things relative to the plan. You can see from the drawing that there's an existing rock wall in the back of the property that kind of angles across the rear of the property, and the building's aligned with that wall, not the road. So the building is at an angle. So number one, that's a visual issue. When you see the front of a building, it's sort of skewed, and that's not a typical orientation for a commercial building. The second issue with respect to commercial buildings is, and especially with a contractor's yard, where the parking areas get used for things other than parking cars, is that ideally that use would be behind the building, hidden by the building. In this case, it's right up front. And to accommodate that, the existing vegetation that's along the front of the building, the property, if you pass there today, would be essentially removed. So you'll see the parking area that's used for things other than parking vehicles sometimes, right in front of a building that's not necessarily the most attractive building, with garage doors that might be open and a lot of activities going on. So that may not be the intent. They may be restricting this. We just don't know. So understanding this is important. While it's skewed, it's still zoning compliant, meets all the setback requirements, so that's not an issue. Mike touched on the parking requirement. There's references, Paul, to having office space in each of these units. We don't have a floor plan showing that. We need to see that. It's a different parking requirement, as Mike noted. So the parking requirement for the property may change. The other issue with respect to parking is that some of the required parking is provided in garage spaces inside the building. If in fact that they're not really used for garage spaces, but storing 2x4s or buckets or whatever, it's not a viable parking space anymore. So that's the trouble we have with contractors' yards, how they're actually used in reality. And this is being divided up into 10 separate spaces, so it's unlikely that it's one contractor. It's likely that the owner of the property is going to lease this to a bunch of guys, and he'll have limited control over 10 guys as opposed to one vendor using the single building. So it gets a little tricky. There's a curb cut that's being proposed. Paul's given a site distance analysis for it. The only question always with site distance analysis is what speed was used for that. If it was the posted speed, that's one thing. We need to compare that to the actual speed, which in this case is probably a little bit quicker than the posted speed. We need to see how trucks are going to maneuver through the property, so turning templates of how you get through. Will there be access behind the building? That's a fire issue. I don't think so because of that wall, but clearly you need to tell us how trucks are maneuvering through the site. The elevation at the front of the property is 368. The first floor elevation is 361. So it appears as though there's a good deal of cut that's going on. So clarify that, Paul, how much material is coming out of the site, if any. That can be a significant impact. And this was an area where there'd been a lot of removal of material over the years. Fairly innovative stormwater management plan that's been proposed, but the site's a hunk of rock. So we need to know, in fact, if you've designed it appropriately, did you take soil borings and all that sort of information that I'm sure Rich has touched on with respect to that stormwater management plan. Again, that wooded frontage is going away. There's some landscaping being proposed, but again, because this is a use that could be visually disruptive, we'd want to see a really robust landscaping plan and screening plan, and that's not what we have at the moment. There's some landscaping notes don't correspond to the plan, so that's a cleanup thing. There's a wet pond that's proposed. The landscaping and the plantings in a wet pond are challenging to get correct, so we need to know a little bit more information so that those in fact live. Exterior lighting, we need to see some illumination levels. There's a note on the plan that speaks to no outdoor storage will be illuminated. which suggests there'll be outdoor storage, because you're not lighting the outdoor storage. So again, that's something we would not want to see on the property. If we do, you got to tell us where it's going. It needs to be screened and identified on the plan. So some issues associated with this application.
Thank you. Paul, you want to give us an overview of the project before I turn it over to the board?
Yeah, a quick view is that Greenpoint Tree Service, they're purchasing the two lots, going to combine them. They're looking to move their operation to the property. And they'll probably take up 3, 4, maybe 5 of the units. But their long-term goal is, as they get older and look to retire, they'd like to be able to have rental units that they could rent out. So that's why we're showing 10 individual units right now. But in actuality, for Greenpoint's use, they could be using 2/3 of the building, or half the building, or a little less. So I'll talk to the staff about how we, work that into the site plan approval. They're not looking to have outdoor storage. They're looking to do everything interior. So anyone who's going to rent a space, they got to keep their equipment and their tools and
Then could you please put that note on the plan?
inside the building. So we'll clarify that.
Yeah, note that on the plan so it's easy to enforce.
And just for reference sake, this is right across the street from Tompkins Recycling Facility, that long-awaited project that, but this is right across the street from that if you go down Old Route 6, so you'll know exactly where it is.
Would they consider, or I think it would be smart, to eliminate that wall, turn that building parallel with the road, set it back?
When you say,
That stone wall's not the property line, correct?
this is a rock face.
What's a rock face?
These are the cliffs that they cut out in the
I
back.
thought it was a stone wall.
Schultz property?
Litigation.
The Meriwether subdivision was bought by Lee Schultz probably back in the 90s.
This is an old
Yeah.
soil excavation.
That's right.
So there's
Schultz is the
actually-
name that's relevant.
It's twofold. He had to get a mining permit from the New York State DEC, and he had to get a town regrading permit for the lots. So he is actually wrapping up his, in essence, mining operation, getting things down to grade. So this existing survey that I gave you, which was based on a survey that was done at a point in time,
He's left on the rock ledge.
was showing higher elevations that are actually physically out there today because he's continued to drop things down to get his final plateau. So I can work that out in terms of giving, up-to-date cross-sections so we can get the earthwork stuff straightened out.
And that was my point earlier. So there were other permits governing how this site was being disturbed that Paul has to comply with first before we start with a new site plan.
So he is pretty much wrapping his operation up, and then we can commence with what it is we would like to do on the property.
What's the plan when they're performing their work and they have a truckload of chipped wood mulch, or they have a load of firewood or trees coming back? Where are they going to stage that? If they're not having outdoor storage, that's,
They would have, if it's a truckload, it's staying in the truck, and it would go inside the building, because there is no room outside to store anything. Now, they probably might have wood drying kilns, and those would be located inside the building also.
Is it possible to move the building and the parking around so the parking's in the back and the building's in the front?
And again, just to follow up, Bob, on that point, so the material's not staying in the truck. I mean, we've seen these
it's going to head on
operations.
the next day.
I don't have a problem with it being dumped in an area behind a building that's
building.
screened. That's not a
that was
bad
where I was getting
location
at,
for
but
something
moving
like
the
that.
building
I was just writing down, it's hard not to imagine piles of wood and wood chips.
I will get more information on that for you.
But to Anthony's and Bob's point, and you mentioned Tompkins is across the street, so we have an opportunity here, right? If you look at what that area looks like now, let's start with this, let's do it right, let's not have the parking in the front, let's have the parking in the rear, and any piles of wood or wood chips or mulch should be hidden from the road, because it just doesn't look good.
I understand that. Let me find out specifically what their intention is regarding wood and/or wood chips that they have at the end
It's
of
an
the day.
opportunity, Paul.
Yes.
And with that would go ample screening, landscape screening on the front.
Mr. Chairman, Mike just raised the point. This is 2 of 7 lots. If it were 3 of 7 lots and there were more area, perhaps you have a better opportunity to devise the plan in a more appropriate manner. We're good at spending other people's money.
Well, it's just the right thing here. I mean,
Do you have an elevation of the building?
Not at this point in time.
one other thing too, since it's going to be a large building visible from the road, what about a rendering?
We will have to provide one for you.
Because we also
Yeah.
played, as you know, with the architecture
Yes.
review also. Other comments from anybody?
Any thoughts on how the building's gonna be constructed? Is it gonna be a pre-engineered steel building?
It's going to be pre-engineered steel building. That's what their thought process was.
Anything else?
Got a lot of comments to address and
Yeah.
more work to do.
We'll see you back here.
Okay. Thank you
Let's
very
put some-
much.
Seriously, let's put some thought into this, that that's a very industrial area. If we do this one right and we do Tompkins right across the street, it's a nice little start. Big improvement. Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Kiwi Country Day School amended site plan. Mike?
The applicant proposes to legalize some amendments to the Kiwi Country Day Camp Site Plan 7717-132, and then additions, changes made to the adjacent 131. Use variance is required to expand the day camp onto the adjacent residential lot that is already occupied by a one-family dwelling. Gave the reason. You cannot, unless otherwise written, have more than one principal use on the lot, and the permitted accessory uses, they have 2 principal uses on this lot. They have an existing use variance for the caretaker's apartment at the existing garage, however, that doesn't cover this building. 4 yurts are labeled for programming. I asked him what that meant, and they said it could be anything, arts and crafts type uses on there. Permits are required for the 2 sheds on 17131. I checked the building department files, there are no permits for sheds in that file. You were gonna check and see if one was removed, I think, Adam?
That one was.
It was, so it's only
Yeah.
one shed then we need a permit
And
for.
the applicant's going to work
That's
with
fine.
the building department on that.
So it's 1 instead of 2.
Pat?
Rich had a memo, all his engineering issues are addressed. And Mike, it's really those zoning issues, the primary issue at the moment. Adam did clarify the yurts. If you remember at the last meeting, we were trying to figure out are they year-round. They don't know yet, so if they're being removed, they'll be replaced on the same pads annually, so it's not shifting all over the site. And if they remain, they'll be designed to accommodate snow loads and wind loads. So either way, and I don't think we have too much of a concern with respect to that, as long as they stay in the same place.
Questions from the board? I know we've seen this a few times now.
No.
Someone make a motion to deny it to the ZBA?
I'll make a motion to deny it to the ZBA.
Second by John, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Run that end.
Yeah.
Gotta buy a new
All
pen.
different date, huh?
Just touch it.
Ah. You cross the other one out. I'll just cross it out initially. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron.
I didn't get a chance to speak, but I'm Will York from Kiwi Country Day. Thank you. This is my first time. Fascinating stuff. Truly appreciate all that you do.
Thank
get
you.
home with my
Thank
kids,
you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is Braymore at Carmel, 49 Seminary Hill Road, extension of final site plan. Mike, I don't believe you had any comments?
This is on for an extension of the approval. I have no objection.
And Pat?
I don't think Rich had an objection. This is a project you've extended and reapproved already. If you remember, this is the 152-bed assisted living facility. So the letter that was submitted from Insight indicate they're still working on stormwater management and bond details. So that's a reasonable request.
And they did submit building plans, so they are moving forward-ish.
So this is an extension for a year, which should be more than ample amount of time, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So as was mentioned, the conditions are well underway. Mike's been dealing with the applicant's architect with regard to initiating a building permit application. The conditions, as I said, including stormwater management agreement, which I believe is still under review by the town council, and the bond and all of that is well underway and getting very close. So as I said, they anticipate construction sometime early 23.
Any other questions? If not, we need a motion to extend the final site plan for a year.
I'll make a motion to extend the final site plan for 1 year.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is Vittorini, Brian, and Genry, 6 Pheasant Place, regrading application. Mike, I don't believe you had any comments,
I did not.
and Pat, I believe you had some, right?
Yeah, Rich had some
No comments,
comments. He needed some detailed information on the plans, and that's really all he had. This is an existing residential property where the fill had been brought in. It's an area next to the existing home. It was a slopey area. It's been installed. The applicant has provided soil data and testing data. Rich has signed off on that and said that the testing indicated that the material was clean. So there really aren't any other significant issues with respect to this. It's a fairly straightforward application, other than the fact it's being done after the fact.
And I think what the board did previously on this, by having that soil tested, was the most important thing we could do.
Yep.
It is at a dead-end street, slope, makes sense to slope it. Next time, come to us first. Any other questions from the board?
No.
I think we need to schedule a public hearing,
You do.
so,
And you can also ask the applicant to speak if he wishes to.
Sorry, it's my first planning board, so.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Alex Barnes, Assistant Project Engineer for Ring Concepts. And as stated before, this is an existing fill pad. Client thought, I think someone down the road had some fill because they were excavating for the new home. And he said his driveway was kind of failing and sloping off to the right side, as you can see over here. So he just kind of thought it was a good idea to get the fill from down the road to fill it. I have some pictures of the fill pad.
please.
I'd like to take a look.
Yeah, please.
This is from the road.
Sharon?
Yeah,
Yep.
that's fine, I can see.
From the road, looking at the house. This is looking back now at the road. And then he also has some silt fence there.
That's why you filled it.
Yeah, this is looking down at the end of the slope. So we're obviously proposing more silt fence around it and a stabilization erosion.
Can you use a microphone, please? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You need to
Microphone.
use a microphone for the people on TV.
Nobody can hear what you're saying. I apologize.
So I guess as I was stating before, I have some pictures here from the site, looking at the road, looking at the house. It's fairly stable, but we are proposing silt fence around the fill at the bottom, the toe of the slope, and an erosion blanket on the slope itself to further stabilize it and some seed and hay to let the grass vegetate.
Are you done bringing in fill?
Yes, as I believe the client is no longer putting any more fill there.
Just a lesson, is we've gone through this before, and someone brought in truckloads, tractor truckloads of soil. Clean soil is hard to get. They had to remove all the soil.
Yeah.
So just, we will not approve something that's not,
No, I totally understand that client kind of came to us and, desperate need, saying that, he was looking for some help, and, we were kind of saying, this is not how you do this. I understand that this is not how it's done. There's a process in this, and, but yes, thank you.
Can I add one more thing? Add the silt fence now.
Yes.
If it's
okay.
not up now, make sure it is up
Yeah,
tomorrow.
There's some silt fence at the end, but we're proposing more.
Get it all up, because if
Yeah.
if the DEP goes out there and sees that, you could get a fine for that.
Big fine, yes.
yeah, out there with a flashlight tonight, putting up the fence.
We did see soil samples, correct? And it came from up the road at a neighbor's house.
Yeah, I didn't.
excavated soil?
Yes, that's what the client was saying.
Anyone else from the board with any questions or concerns?
No, I'm good.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to schedule a public hearing.
All in favor?
Aye.
We'll see you back here. The public needs an opportunity to weigh in on this.
Definitely.
Your neighbors.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay, next on our agenda is we're going to break out into a session facilitated by Pat to review the Carmel Comprehensive Master Plan, zoning code draft. Pat, would you just remind us where we're going to continue on?
So what we tried to do is, as opposed to the nitty-gritty of how many boats are required on the lake, we're trying to start at the goal, at the 30,000-foot level of dealing with the goals of the plan, and then move toward the specifics about boats on the lake. So we're still going through the goals section of the plan, and I think we can finish that up tonight. And then we want to talk about the new zones that have been created, where they are, and the uses that are allowable, and the zoning criteria associated with each of those. I don't know if we're going to get to that tonight, Mr. Chairman, but let's try to get through the goals section.
And just for the board to know, the next meetings with the consultant here and the town board is on November 9th and December 14th. I think it is helpful for everybody to attend, so that when we get down to the nitty-gritty, we know what our community is saying, because we're representing the community, right?
Yeah, it's very helpful to hear that.
Yeah.
And it was also illuminating to hear that that was the issue, right? Only the one gentleman stood up who raised the very relevant point about, do you have enough
Infrastructure.
sewer and water to do any of this stuff?
Right.
So that was interesting to hear that.
Thank you.
So we've got up to goal 6, which was transportation, complete streets and trails. So let's go through those quickly. And objective 1 was to adopt a complete streets resolution for the town. Complete streets is a planning theory that requires all of our streets operate in a multimodal way. They accommodate cars, and they have sidewalks for pedestrians, and there are bike lanes for cyclists. It all works together and relates to the land uses on either side of them. So in terms of driveways and curb cuts, it's all looked at holistically. So that falls under this planning term of complete streets. And there are manuals for complete streets. There's design criteria for complete streets, and they're suggesting that we adopt such a thing, which is just good, sound, common sense planning. So good recommendation. Like everything else, the devil will be in the details of what those complete street standards are. And Bonnie's given some generalized criteria associated with that, all good stuff. So I think that's a recommendation we could lean into and acknowledge its usefulness. By the way, also pointing out some of the limitations. So as we've talked about all the time, periodically, we don't control all of our streets, and most of our controversial projects are not on local streets. They're on county roads or state roads. So the county and the state aren't adopting complete streets programs, the town would be. We can't govern what goes on those roads. So there's the disconnect that we need to bridge to find out if they would be willing to mirror our standards on their roadways, and vice versa, frankly. So that's this whole problem we have with intermunicipal cooperation. It's us and the DEP, it's us and the DOT. And it only works when it works together. So the second one is off-street parking requirements. So Bonnie has offered an array of parking regulations, generally revolving around reducing parking standards when there are opportunities to do things like shared parking, or when there are parking areas adjacent to multimodal transportation facilities and so forth. We don't have a lot of those, so our parking criteria is one of our challenges. So we can't reduce numbers so that our commercial uses are underparked. And we're at a point in time where that's all changing. So it's a very difficult time to adjust our parking requirement for retail uses when we don't even have retail uses anymore. What should those numbers be? If we continue to use the numbers we've used in the past, is that an impediment to attracting a retail use who could go to another community where there is a lower parking requirement? And if that's the case, do we adjust our parking requirements? In repurposing our hamlets, bringing in residential use, we saw a couple of applications that we've had recently where they can't provide their parking on site, so they're leasing parking in an adjacent commercial parking lot. So now if we reduce the commercial parking requirements, we've got a problem because where the residential use is going in those shared parking spaces. So again, the concept of looking at our parking requirements is a smart thing to do. We should dust them off and we should pay attention to them. But there's not a simple answer. This isn't a place like, again, a bigger city in Peekskill where there's lots of opportunity to share parking. There's municipal parking structures. There's a lot of public transit. We don't have that in our community, so we rely on single passenger vehicles. That's 99% of the movement around our community, and those cars start and end in a parking space. So
And part of that is Swan Cove is, the numbers vary. I don't think it's a closed number yet, but the Swan Cove is gonna bring with it anywhere from 80 to 100 to 110 parking spaces. Those numbers are still in flux. And then, when we change the diagonal parking, the diagonal parking on 6N, which the state wants us to do, we lose about 17 parking spaces.
Right.
So it's a give and take. Not sure where that's gonna end up yet.
Yeah, and one of the pieces to this equation is if we do adjust these numbers, typically what's done in return is the provision of more public parking. So that's the same issue that we've talked about with respect to sewer and water. That's a cost to the municipality. We have to buy property to build parking facilities or parking lots or parking structures. That's a cost. So if we do this adjustment, you have to bear in mind providing additional public parking costs something. So should we be absorbing that cost, or do we require private developers to do it and keep the numbers high where they're building all the parking for us? So it's an interesting conversation to have. And I think what Bonnie's simply done is thrown out some ideas without really saying this is what we should do. And by the way, it's probably different in Carmel as opposed to the stretch of along Mahopac down to Somers. It's probably going to be different in different areas. It's going to be different in the shopping centers compared to the hamlets, where there is multiple trips with a single parking spot in a shopping center. You'll park once and you'll go to the deli and you'll go to the supermarket and you'll do something else. In the hamlet areas, that's not necessarily the case. That's the ideal solution, but currently it's not the case. You park in front of the bagel place and then you go and you park in front of the next dry cleaner or whatever it is. If it were a more vibrant area, you'd park once and you'd be willing to walk up and down the street because there's lots of stuff going on. We don't have all that much going on, so I'm inclined to get back in the car and drive that 300 feet to the next location because there's nothing to do as you walk between the locations.
So Pat, this is one of many examples. So Bonnie, understandably so, put out a bunch of ideas. When we get, as you mentioned earlier, down into the details, is the town board looking for us to review something like this and say, no, yes, okay, that's a good idea, no, no? I mean,
Yeah, what I think our role is to say, we have questions. Did you think about this? What's the solution to these things? I don't think the town board is asking for us to solve those problems. I think the town board's asking to us to look at what has been proposed by Nelson Pope and say, there could be a question with respect to this strategy. So in the case of this parking strategy, there's 10 bullets, right? Some of them make sense, some of them don't make sense. We may go through each of them and say, yeah, great in Carmel, not so great in a shopping center. So we can
But that's my
provide
point. We
our
need-
local context to some of these, but we don't have to say, but the number should be 1.25 spaces for that particular use.
You answered my question. So the point is, we probably have to go through each one of these line items at some point in this review and say, look, we don't like this idea for the following reasons, or, yeah, this,
Yes, no, or
yeah.
modify it.
So that, there's, okay.
So
So when we
along
get to the detail, it's gonna be,
So along those lines, I've got some of those comments. So I'd like to just focus on the third bullet in relation to the last bullet, and I'm focused on downtown Mahopac. You know, by all accounts, listening to the discussions about Swan Cove at the public meetings, I've continually heard there's not enough parking,
Yep.
there's not enough parking. And as Craig says, once the adjustment gets made for diagonal parking, it becomes more
There'll be
of a
less.
concern. So on the third bullet, for downtown Mahopac, I don't see in reality a situation where we, in the planning board, which is where this will end up resting, can, in good faith, allow a reduction in parking because there's available parking elsewhere unless something changes dramatically. So that will boot a property owner into the last bullet, and the last bullet will essentially allow for a fee in lieu of parking. And I have a concern about that because somebody just pays a fee into the parking, and the rest of the community has to deal with an influx of customers or clients
Yep.
who are going to be parking on the street. I don't think that's a good idea.
So, yeah, that's a good point, Bob. And the fee in lieu provisions, if you look at the communities that have it, it's not the cost of a parking space in a parking structure. So it's not $40,000 a space or $20,000 a space. It's $3,000 or $9,000.
So it's a cost.
that goes into a kitty,
so it
and
goes-
maybe 10 years from now or 20 years from now, there'd be enough to build a parking lot. But in the meantime, nothing's being solved.
And I see a potential for abuse there.
Yep.
And,
Yeah, that's right. So now it becomes subjective. We'll just take the money and.
yeah, exactly.
It'll become a fee that's built into
It,
building.
it's a cost of doing business. I'll
That's
pay the
exactly
fee
it.
and I
you're
won't
not
have to pay
solving the
parking.
problem
Yeah,
necessarily
Yeah.
for decades.
yeah.
The other issue that I just want to make sure everybody's aware is everybody, no matter where you are, they think there's not enough parking. There's a perception that parking is inadequate, even when there's plenty of parking. And when you'll see parking surveys that are actually being done, again, where was the analysis that produced this? But nevertheless, when you see those, there's always excess parking. It's always a perception that there's not enough parking. And what it comes from is people going to work and parking in front of their store when that should be a customer parking there. So when the customer shows up and he can't park in front of the store, there's no parking, it's a deficiency, and it's oftentimes the merchants that are creating the parking problem because it's more convenient to park in front of your store. So there's always that perception. So there is a fine balance, and right now, we don't have data to say there's definitively a parking deficiency or there's excess parking. We don't know. We're speculating, and we're saying, let's do some things to fix the problem, and we don't really understand the scope of the problem. So that's one of the things that makes me a little bit uncomfortable with some of these recommendations. Where's the data to support this?
ShopRite in Carmel.
That's a
They
great
had
example.
all that parking to the right
right,
side,
yeah.
but nobody wanted, they want to park right in front of where they're shopping,
Yeah.
of course, but they had it on site, so it was a perfect example
great
of.
example. This board looked at that many times.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, thanks.
So again, I think the way, so remember what this is gonna produce is, I'm taking all the input that we've been talking about in these meetings, and I'm gonna prepare a memo that will go to you, for you guys to edit, revise, modify, redline. That's what will go to the town board. So I'm gonna try to be the first cut of your voice, but it's going to be your voice eventually that gets sent to the town board. 6.2.6.3, create a town bike and trail plan that identifies rights of way throughout the town. Great idea. We have a regionally magnificent bike path through the county at the moment. Making connections into that is a great thing. We see it all the time over here, people cutting across the road to get onto the bike path and nearly getting killed as people are coming up the hill around the corner or driving out of town hall or whatever it is. If there were if the road were properly striped, identified, signed, making that crossing would be a lot safer. That should exist 50 places throughout the town to accommodate the connections to the bike trail. And again, great idea, perfect thing to have in the comp plan. Show us where we should do it, show us exact locations. That would be a great thing to be in the comp plan, but a great idea, I think. Oh, and the other thing is making those connections into the areas that we're trying to focus, the hamlets. So that's where the focus should be. So people can actually go on the bike trail and then stop in a hamlet and have lunch or whatever it is. There's the connectivity that really works. The bike trail as you go, it works periodically, but as you go down through Westchester's bike trails, they drop you off into the downtowns. And it's a perfect, dynamic relationship.
Yeah, that's a good point.
6.5, continue to improve walkability.
Can we just go back to 6.4?
I'm sorry.
Just one thought about the the trails. At least for the stretch that is mostly within downtown Mahopac, maybe elsewhere, we ought to consider as a goal the maintenance and, I put it in the subject of maintenance, but people walk their dogs, they don't pick up after their dogs, and it becomes a putrid mess.
Yep.
And if you want to beautify a walking trail, something has to be done about that. I'm not sure whether it's enforcement, whether it's putting bag dispensers,
That's a great
along the
thing.
way,
Yep.
and a bin to put it in when you're leaving the trail.
Yep, and you know where the concentration is.
Yeah.
The evidence is on the ground. So
Exactly.
You can properly
You
locate
have
them.
garbage pails there and you have a dispenser.
Yep, you grab the
Exactly.
bag.
Exactly.
People will use it.
What's
Yeah.
worse
They
now
do
on
use
the bike path in Putnam, or Westchester also, is you'll go to a certain spot, and you're better off not picking up after your dog than one area has 50 bags on the grass.
Right, just sitting there.
Plastic.
Yeah,
There's no place.
There's no place.
And if you had a
You're
whiny
better off not
garbage
bagging
can.
than leaving the plastic.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So those are easy solutions, I
Yep.
think, but those are quality of life things that matter a lot.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
what I think I said to you at the very first meeting, when we adopt this, there's a whole lot of low-hanging fruit that we can take care of right out of the box. That's an example of one, and you do 50 of those actions in the first month after the adoption of the comprehensive plan, you're making progress.
Yeah.
And they're really easy things to do. So and Bonnie's given, by the way, there is long-term, short-term goals in the plan, so she's identified that. So that's a great thing. 6.5 is what I talked about earlier, is improving the walkability, so reducing curb cuts, crosswalks, all of that stuff. The crosswalk technology today is, I think most of you have seen elsewhere, is really special. There's automatic sensors, there's lighting, there's, the designs of crosswalks and so forth are really quite spectacular, and they're very safe. They're even safe for people that, have disabilities and so forth. You can actually make it through. The timing on the red lights, things
Yeah.
like that, they're really terrific. That's things where we can get grants for those types of things to facilitate accessibility. Tapping into like the ADA funding for things like that is a source of funding, so another great idea. Consolidating curb cuts, we deal with this on virtually every site plan application. Where does the curb cut go? Only put one instead of two. The big disputes we've had on some of these applications precisely over that issue. So again, this is a good planning policy. And again, remember what we talked about at the very first meeting. What this plan is going to do for you is give you to strengthen your spine when you're talking to an applicant. So right now, we're the planning board and we're telling you to do something. You'll now have, we're the planning board and we're telling you to do something, and policy 645 in the plan says you ought to do this. So it reinforces your ability to just plan better for the community. So that's what 80% of this plan is going to do for us as a community, is give you, the zoning board, more guidance in making good decisions. And by the way, the applicants know that ahead of time. They can read the plan too and know that's what the board's going to expect, instead of poor Paul Lynch standing here tonight and getting 300 comments and looked like a deer in the headlights over there for a while.
Will that end up in the code?
So that depends. So some of it's in the code, some of it's just in the comprehensive plan as a goal to be achieved.
Just wondering if that,
Yeah.
if from there it ends up in zoning, then it's something that I could actually
Ab-
write to you and tell you, section ABC says this,
That
they
would
should
be
go to
good.
there. That would be good.
But if it's not in the zoning, and as we get to the design things, probably, that's
So
going
it's
to be
a
a
weaker
question.
provision. If it's just a goal, we'd like you to do this. It's much better when Mike has the authority to enforce it. But at least it's something. Right now, we have nothing.
Okay.
Well, so much of what we've been hearing so far with the meetings is enforcement.
Yeah.
Lack thereof.
Exactly.
This will, that's all about water, what we've been talking about lakefront, but
So-
this
so-
will be really
So-
important for Mike.
So should one of our comments be to consider carefully moving some of the.
Goals to
To the
zoning.
final zoning plan, yeah,
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 To make them more enforceable.
yeah.
exactly. And the last transportation issue is traffic calming. So this is interesting. The DOT and the county take that very seriously, and they have the ability to control those types of things. Traffic calming is, for those that don't know, it's taking measures on the roadways that make motorists slow down. So oftentimes, it's actually narrowing lanes. It's actually creating chicanes so that you have to slow down to make a little turn before you continue going straight. Speed bumps are examples of traffic calming. Interestingly, we have a lot of small windy country lanes. They're inherently traffic calmed. You can't go fast on them because they're windy, narrow country lanes. So I don't know how much we have to go down that road, no pun intended, to deal with traffic calming. Certainly when we can, we should. But this is more of an issue for the county and the state. And that's when the state starts installing roundabouts along stretches of roadways, when they start narrowing pinch points to slow people down. And it works. Traffic calming works when you look at the statistics that come out of the analysis of those things. It's reduced incidents on the roads, accidents, deaths way down when you install these traffic calming measures. So it's, again, just good, solid, common sense planning stuff. But again, we just don't have that much control over it on our big, dangerous roads. And our little roads are pretty country lanes. They're not, people aren't speeding on them to begin with,
They did that on Route 55 through Arlington, which was very straight, high speed, but
That's
a
a-
lot of retail. Every X amount of miles, they put a roundabout.
That's exactly
And
right.
it actually really made it look a little quainter.
Yep, exactly right.
They
And,
planted it, it looks, yeah.
yeah,
Really nice job.
and you gotta pay attention when you're driving around that roundabout. You gotta slow down.
If you slow down, then you see the different stores.
That's exactly right, right? Yeah, it works. So the last set of goals they have is historic, scenic, and cultural resources. So this is interesting for you because you serve as the architectural board, so a lot of this does overlap with your roles and your responsibilities. So the first one is something that we've all talked about for years, which are design guidelines. So right now, you operate as the architectural review board without any guidance. There's nothing in a code anywhere in the town to help you make those decisions. So design guidelines are a tool that would enormously benefit you. Going to be easy and hard to do. Easy because we don't really have a quaint historic character. We've constantly said we want this New England aesthetic, but it's not as though it exists in great context to provide, that's the neighboring building, I want to be like that. Most of our buildings are crappy buildings, candidly. So we've been trying to do this incrementally with new buildings. But defining it, we've struggled with defining it.
Yeah.
What does it exactly mean? So this isn't something that's Mike and I are going to whip up. This is something that's going to require specialists to help with this. And I don't know that Nelson Pope has that ability or not, but we really, if we're going to do design guidelines, they need to be well-prepared design.
Maybe our architectural
Consultant,
consultant
yeah.
could
Yep,
help it.
that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. That's a good point. 7.2, downtown design overlay district, kind of the same thing. And what this is going back to the zoning issue of encouraging infill development in the hamlets. That's what we want to get. That's the objective. That's the primary objective for us to get done. They're suggesting an overlay district. That's sort of contradictory to the zoning that they've created, which is a separate zone, not an overlay district. So I don't know which way they want to go with respect to that. Overlays trouble me a little bit because it becomes arbitrary, and who's the sponsor of the overlay? The more definitive approach is just change the zoning. Just say this is what we want, these are the rules that we want in place, boom, it's permanent, not an overlay. 7.3, consider requiring art sculptures as part of streetscape improvements to add visual, that's great, love it. Public art's a great thing, it can be a very beneficial thing, it can create gateways for us, which we really don't have. We have signage in some places, but public art's a great thing to encourage. We have art communities nearby, we have artists in the community, it's a great resource to tap into. And by the way, that's, in many instances, free effort, you know, to get my name out there. I'll give you a sculpture if you put it in town hall, and you can have it if you put my name on it, kind of thing. So a lot of times that comes at very little cost. Beautify the main transportation corridors, yep, same thing. Gateways, again, the problem with this is those main transportation corridors aren't our rights of way. So we need DOT to allow us to do stuff. As you know, DOT's rules are black and white, so they don't like to modify things, so putting a piece of art in their right-of-way violates their roadway standards. So it becomes a big deal, it's gotta go up to Albany, they have to make a decision. So they're in the way of some of these provisions, but I love them, it's a great idea.
Pat, on 7.4, just, you know, I like this too, just an added point. If what we're trying to do is beautify the corridor, you drive down Route 6 going north, down the hill past Bucks Hollow Road, and within a block or two, the thing that stares you in the face is a dilapidated bus shelter.
Yeah.
It's got cracked window panes, the grass is growing, the cement is all cracked. I mean, this seems like low-hanging fruit.
So
Either get rid of it or deal with it.
So not to interrupt, when John and I were out looking at the Dave Nichols property, that's where this is. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I owe you guys an answer from the county. Transportation owes me an answer as to which ones are gonna be utilized, which ones can we take down, which ones can they take down. I already volunteered ourselves as the highway department, not Carmel, my daytime employer. So we'll take it down if you want, but they owe me an answer next week as to what's gonna be utilized, what's not, and what needs to get revammed.
We were there for that property. And of course,
Congratulations.
we asked, Dave has been doing to a lot of our, Dave, you gotta clean this up. And then we looked at the bus shelter, and John said he'll get his team if necessary to get the soils all on, just take it. It's better, but obviously you gotta go through the proper channels. John's been working on that. There's also mailboxes out there that I asked Dave to,
So that's a great example. So right now, it's just you doing this for people. That's great. If it's in the plan, we, the town, collectively can say, hey, county.
You owe me an answer.
it's funny you brought that up, because John and I went after
Yeah,
that.
you haven't yelled at me in a while about that. so-
I usually ask John every meeting, John, what's the status? John, what's the
Should I
status?
pay you $5
By the
now,
way,
or?
That's the key to all of this. It's finding the guy. Finding the one guy that can make this stuff happen.
Yeah.
So
And I,
John and a Sawzall is all we might need to.
and they still have, that property still has not gotten the DOT approval, even though we met them there. It was-
Oh, right.
But I did tell Joel when he called me the other day, I'm not signing off on that until the property's cleaned up, as
Yeah, which
promised.
was, one of your conditions of approval, right? That was 4.7.5, preserve existing historic buildings, kind of no-brainer. There are, the National and State Register of Historic Places are great resources. Anyone can nominate buildings. So the local historian, the planning board, anyone can nominate those buildings. Once they're nominated, they're put into a special category. They don't have to be listed, they just need to be eligible for nomination. And that puts them in a special category. So a lot of communities have nominated hundreds of properties, just so they have a level of control over properties they think are important or significant to the community.
So Pat, if I'm a property owner and I'm not willing to do this myself and somebody else does it to me, are there any legal ramifications to that or economic ramifications?
Oh, yeah. So you're restricted, so once you're identified as on the National or State Register, basically your building is frozen in amber, you can't do anything. you're allowed to, maintain it essentially, but you couldn't change the shutters. You couldn't paint it a different color. You couldn't add a different roof material. It's that restrictive. Could someone do it to you without your permission? The answer is potentially, yeah. So lots of town historic societies designate homes, and the people never even knew about it. Eventually, the owner gets notified. Part of the process of nominating is notifying the owners. But yeah, somebody could nominate your house out from underneath of you and turn it into a historic landmark, and you can't put a swimming pool in the backyard.
What if you don't know when you change your roof?
So, yeah, I mean, so it, like anything, you could probably get away with that, but we, just if you fill out, right now, Mike, if you fill out an EAF, it's done online, and all of those facilities pop up automatically. So it's, you don't really have an excuse anymore to say, I didn't know. But people will.
So continuing with my hypothetical, if I'm
Yeah.
a property owner and I see it happening, do I have the
I
ability
think
to
so.
object?
It's an elaborate process, and I've been involved with it a couple, it's a very elaborate process. It takes years. The state historians have to come out and evaluate the property. So it's a big deal. And you, as the owner, you're notified and you're part of that process.
And is it a cloud on your title?
It's a cloud, yeah, once you're officially designated.
It wouldn't be a cloud on the title, but it could be an impediment to you either developing the property or resale of the property, certainly, unless somebody
sure.
wanted to buy it for historical purposes.
So with all that, is that something that the town board ought to consider before it
So the
goes
way
full
to
hog
do this
into this?
properly is
Yeah.
a historic survey of the community, where there would be, you'd hire a historian, and they would evaluate the entire community and say, there's 50 potentially eligible properties, let's talk to the property owners, let's see how eligible they are. Joe can tell you stories too, from the case law. It's archaeological and historic resources, that's what the state controls. And there are instances where there's, and I have been involved in these.
We
where-
saw that with the cell tower.
Exactly right. There's, yeah, exactly right. So there's an overhanging rock, and probably, Native Americans used that as a shelter sometime in the past. There's no evidence of that, there's no historical but the state historian will say that's probably the case, and you can't do anything within 500 feet of it, and that gets preserved in amber. You've just lost.
Wasn't it the Poe House?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's some communities embrace this, Bob, others are reluctant to embrace it just because of the property rights issues associated with it.
Well, it's just that I think, we're supposed to represent the community, and the property owners of these potential historic buildings are members of the community, and they ought to have a say in this.
And I'll say another thing with respect to this. Sometimes it's George Washington slept here, historic building, you want to preserve it. Other times, it's just an example of a type of architecture.
Yeah.
And that's why it's being preserved. George Washington never slept there. It's just that it's a good example of federal pre-whatever design.
Is there a way to deal with this that provides, so it becomes a cooperative process, a way to provide incentives to a property owner?
So yes, so once you are designated, there are incentives. So maintaining a historic property, the SHPO provides grants to help you maintain your property. So yes, there's pros and cons.
Okay.
And your assessment gets adjusted as a result of the fact that your house is preserved in amber, so to speak, so.
So the more historic stuff we have, the lower our property taxes.
My certiorari's are being filed every year. It's 1 year older, so.
For that
lower
individual.
my tax
Everybody
rate
else in
one more
town
time.
goes up. Yeah. No. 7 years old.
So again, it's an interesting conversation, and there are two sides to this, and just simply saying we should do it. There's a caveat. We want to make sure
yeah,
everybody
just consider
understands the
this.
pros and cons of doing it. So the next goal is allow for the adaptive reuse of historic buildings. So that's kind of contrary to preserving historic buildings. Adaptively reusing them is changing them from their historic character. So again, I'm not sure where we're trying to go with some of these. So again, a lot of this is a lot of good ideas, but were they tailored to our specific interests? That's what I'm trying to get us to focus on. Provide the planning board with historic review authority when reviewing projects. So this is just adding another level to you, which we don't have any basis for making those judgments. just like architectural review. So now you're going to be the Historic Preservation Review Board without any guidance with respect to that. Is your property historic or not? What guidelines do you have to govern decisions if you make? So I don't know that you want to assume that authority, but
What is the preferred way of dealing with it?
say again?
What is the preferred structure for dealing with it?
So no one is. So what happens now, it's simply the State Historic Preservation Office. So it's actually a very efficient system. So it's called the CRIS, Cultural Resource Information System. And you do it right now for your property. It's an online system. You type in your address, and the state has research on properties all over the place. And you'll find that all of a sudden, there's a whole lot of information about your property that you didn't know. And somebody in the state over the past 100 years has thought about your property. And I don't know if it's everybody's property, but it's a very simple process, and you get responses from the state in about a week. And they tell you and what's the story with your property and the surrounding property, and you're within 500 feet of a cemetery, and George Washington slept over there. So it's a great system, and they like to be involved in this system, so that's the other thing that we need to be aware of. If we're engaging this system, it's not, intrusive is the wrong word, but they're all in.
But didn't we, with the cell tower, because I'm not really looking to raise my hand, I'm taking over that responsibility here. We have enough with the architecture review, I believe, but with the cell tower, we put on the applicant to work with that
Yeah.
association you just mentioned.
Yeah, the state is,
I personally think.
that's what I'm telling you, Craig. The state is very good at this.
Why
Because
take it
the
on?
state's just gonna question us anyway, so let's let the applicant deal directly with the state and come back to us, yes, the state
And
reviewed,
what-
this is what they said.
And what makes
That's
us
how
the
we
expert?
respond to that.
The best situation is when you have a historic district. That's when you want to control it yourself. Like if you think of Bedford's downtown, it's a historic district, and they control that area. It deserves local control. They want to control that. But an individual home here and a site there, the state does a good job of
Let's
protecting.
let the applicant deal with the state on that.
7-8. This is all the same stuff. Develop a list of historic resources. That's a great idea. Who does that is important. Pursue local landmark designations. So that's one way to sort of circumvent this process, which is just to create the Town of Carmel historic plaque. And it doesn't do anything to your property. It doesn't limit anything, but you get a plaque on your property, and some people like plaques on their property. So that's what I think that's referring to. And 7-10, same thing, historic plaque program. 7-11 is allow the building department and the planning board to enforce the design guidelines. I don't know that you're an enforcement agency. He's the enforcement agency. I don't think you want to assume that responsibility in any way. You would implement the design guidelines through your approval process, and then it would be codified in approval, and Mike would be the enforcement agent. I don't think we want to mess with that system.
But I would want the design guidelines to be in the zoning code.
So Mike can enforce
So,
them.
well, so it's clear to us, so we're not in a back and forth of trying to plead and cajole and, dealing with recommendations in the comprehensive plan. I'd like to see it in black and white. And I'll come to this a little bit later with some of the language. I want clear language about what's allowed and what is a suggestion. There's some weak wording and sometimes contradictory wording about those types of things. So we'll get to that.
That's a great point. So we can come back to that. 7-12, so now this is sort of fringy stuff that they're talking about, promote education and visitor interest in town by interpretive signage. It's great stuff, I love it. It's not necessarily a fundamental goal for us.
Got to maintain it.
Yeah, exactly right. So that's actually a very good point. You've seen those things that are in sad shape, and that's worse than having a.
Yeah.
Or bus stops.
Yeah, exactly
Yeah.
right. Work with the historical side, create a walking tour, great. Preserve scenic and rural historic character of the town's roads, again, great, but most of our roads are county and state roads. But they're referring to things like stone walls, that creates the quaint nature of our back roads, lovely. We do that on a regular basis. I don't know that necessarily has to turn into a rule or a regulation, and I think you do want to have some discretion on that. But the theory and the goal is perfectly appropriate.
Well, some people don't want walls in their front yard.
And some walls are inappropriate. You can't see when you get to the driveway. You should remove the wall. We've experienced that
There's
out.
plus
in
and
this-
minus on both sides there, so you have to really think about that.
That's why, again, the idea is good, but I wouldn't make it a law or a requirement or a rule. So I wanted, the next piece that I wanted to touch, they have a series of suggested design guidelines. We can talk about those, but I'd like to get to the next piece.
Before you go to that, just
Go ahead,
one
Bob, I'm sorry.
just one objection.
Yep, go ahead.
Duck, North Carolina, as an example, I just want to renew the point that I made previously, that this is on an extensively long barrier island with more than enough view shed. The picture that you see on the bottom of 72, that's contradictory to other provisions that are in this that say that that waterfront development and viewshed protection should be perpendicular to the shoreline, not parallel to the shoreline. And I know from personal experience, this particular commercial stretch with the boardwalk is obscured from you cannot see the ocean from
the street.
From the street. What you see is a parking lot and buildings.
Not good.
So,
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, that goes to what you heard earlier today, when people were realizing we have these little narrow strips. How do you deal with that when someone puts
Yeah.
their shed in that narrow strip? You don't see the waterfront anymore. There's no question about it. So that's why the concern about a local waterfront plan, how does that really fit into our specific circumstances? Gets a little tricky. There's no doubt about it. I wanted to talk about, I don't know how much endurance we have left, but let me just hand out this. So the next piece that I think is fundamental to talk about at this level is the new zoning. So I just want to just hand these out. I want to illustrate something to you. So this is why this is a significant concern of everybody. This is the big stuff. So this is our zoning today. So effectively, so effectively, we have two zones. We have the residential zone, 3 acres minimum, and we have a commercial zone. There's a couple of other zones that are basically DEP lands and restricted property conservation zones, but effectively, see on that, it's two zones. That's being changed to 13 zones. That's a huge change. So what I gave to you is the description of each of those zones, and what would be in each of those, and this is the map of where those are. So we have to do two things. We have to go through the description of each of those zones, and the zoning criteria to determine, is it suitable to have two different zones, or should it be one zone? And the other piece is this the right boundary? Should it be moved? Should it be this way or that way? Why are they constructed the way they've been constructed? So that's a big task. So what I just thought we'd do is just quickly go through that list so we have an understanding of the zones that have been proposed.
That map, the proposed rezoning is in our.
It is.
plan.
Yep, but that's just a bigger one so you can see it better.
from here.
So again, 13 different zones, and I just want to go through them quick. So the first one is a conservation zone. That's really what we have today. That's the DEP land. Nothing's happening on that anyway. But I was talking to Craig earlier today or yesterday, and interestingly, which is fine, we want that, means it's environmentally constrained, you shouldn't do anything on it. However, the proposal allows single-family homes in that zone as a special permit. So is it a conserved zone, or are you allowing new single-family homes? It's one thing, grandfathered existing homes that may exist there, fine, but the current proposal allows brand-new single-family homes in a zone that's being created as a conservation zone.
Isn't that contradictory?
That's
So we should not, if it's truly conservation, we shouldn't allow any building there other than what's grandfathered, I would guess.
So I'm assuming Ron has included that for the fear of a taking, but it's already a conservation zone. For the most part, these are already restricted
What do you
areas.
mean for fear of it taking?
So if this were a new conservation zone, and we took the 3
Okay,
acre zone
yeah.
and said, now you can't build anything, that's
Yeah,
an
yeah.
obvious taking. In this case, it's already a conservation zone, so I don't think that's a concern at all, so why is that there? That's the kind of questions I think you should think about when you look at each of these zones. That's an example of one of them. First big zone is open space residential. That's the existing 3 acre zone. Just an aside, it's our existing 3 acre zone, which we don't call an open space zone now. It's our residential zone. So they're referring to it as an open space residential zone. Is it an open space zone?
Doesn't that just confuse things? Why not just call it residential?
Or low-density residential, and then high-density residential. That's what the typical nomenclature is. Open space has a suggestion
Yeah,
associated with it. And right now, we certainly wouldn't consider a 3 acre subdivision open space. They're squeezing every 3 acre lot they can out of their 10 acre parcel. Where's the open space?
Open space is more when we have the cluster subdivisions.
Precisely right.
That's what we've
precisely
been.
right. So again, that's the kind of thing I want us to think about. And that zone, the description of it is fine. It is a low-density residential zone. But if you read the last sentence, consistent with the town's rural character, including agricultural-related uses that would cater to tourists as well as residents. So now we're taking what is our residential zone and suggesting that a use that is not really prevalent in the community, which is agricultural use, is something we want to emphasize in that zone. So is it a low-density residential zone, or is it an agricultural zone or a tourism zone? If you put all of that, so it seems confusing to me to create all of these different zones, yet still combine different uses into a single zone. In the current condition, you can call our one residential zone all you want, because we only have one zone. If we have 13 zones, maybe there should be an agricultural zone and a tourism zone as opposed to our residential zone. Remember where I started our conversation with this, which was sewer and water. So if the single residential zone we have today, where we know it works, it's a 3 acre zone, and if you don't have sewer and water, we likely get septic systems on those properties. Works okay. A third of that property is changing to 1 acre zones. And we don't know if there's sewer and water, or if septic systems will fit on 1 acre zones in a lot of these places, particularly because the lots that are left are constrained properties. They're not the flat level properties with good soils. They're the crappier properties. That's why they're still developable. So that's part of this whole conversation about how we discretely define these zoning districts.
The only one thing I will add, Pat, if you have a 3 acre lot that is constrained by a slope or a wetland or anything, that wetland gets taken out of the calculation.
That's the net issue.
So it's the net of the acre. So you may have a 3 acre lot, but because it's either steep or wet or whatever else it's constrained by, that would still lower it to the 1 acre, but you're still allowed to build a house with the 1 acre if you have the ability to get a septic or sewer, even though the lot's 3, but you're constrained to only 1 of the acres. That's why, I think that's why that was put in there that way, Pat, to be honest with you.
So if you have a 1 acre, a new 1 acre zone, and somebody wants to build in it, and they have to get septic approval, isn't that the health department?
Yep.
And if they can't get that approval, they can't do it, right? So do we care is my point.
Why do it if it's not going to work? So that's kind of the whole exercise. Yeah, why do we care if it's not developed? It's just vacant land, so what? That's fine.
So are you suggesting leaving it at 3?
No, not necessarily. I'm suggesting the areas that is created for 1 acre should be
Surveyed?
viable.
I'm sorry?
They should be viably developable to support 1 acre.
How do you do that? In other words, what has to be done in order for that
So
to happen?
very basically, is there sewer and water? When the instances where there isn't, basic soil conditions. So there, the county soil survey indicates. So we don't have to do perk tests on every property, but we do have the ability to access GIS data that says where there are soils that are viable and soils that aren't. And even in instances, this is a slippery slope. So even as you know, if you don't have good soil, you can augment your soil and meet the health department's criteria. So there's ways around these sorts of things, but again, this goes back to my point of why are the boundaries where they are? Somebody thought about that line, and I'm simply saying the line ought to be in a place where it belongs, as opposed to just an aspirational line, which is, if you get a 1 acre lot, great, if you don't, you don't. we should think about that more carefully.
Okay.
That's all I'm suggesting.
I don't know if you want to get down to the details here, but on the residential, or low-density residential.
Yep.
Lower high, the 3 acre, it says, well, it's intended to allow primary low-density, single-family residential uses, supporting community facilities and services. Fine. It will also allow limited non-residential uses that are consistent with the town's rural character, including agricultural-related uses.
Yeah.
Why would we, including tourists?
That's
Why,
what- yeah.
if we
That's
all
what
buy
it's-
a house in this area, and the next thing I know, one of our neighbors start doing something with tourism or agriculture-related use, why would we want that there?
Just think of the horse farms we've seen.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we've seen them in 10
Chicken
neighbors.
farms, Mike's Chicken
Chicken,
Farm.
yeah, we've lots of neighbor issues associated with that, which leads me to believe they're not benign uses, they're uses that attract neighboring opposition. So,
I think we have to look at these definitions are important.
But again,
Where are the definitions?
On the second page.
Oh, on the
back
second
handout.
page,
yeah,
okay.
flip it over.
again, it goes back to what I said before, though, and again, I'm not defending or
Yeah.
swaying, it's just, if you have a 3 acre lot now, okay, and that's required to, you're in the 3 acre zone. If a part of it is wet or steep or anything, you may need 5 acres.
Yeah, yeah,
Just to get a lot.
yeah.
That's why they did, I'm pretty sure that's why they did the 1 acre, to make it that there's still an ability to build, even if you have sewer and water, Pat.
Yep.
If you have a steep slope or a wetland on your property, a lake, a pond, anything on there, that is taken out. So now your 3 acre lot is now 4.5 or 5 acres possibly, because of a wetland or something else, and you may have sewer and water there. I mean, that's part of the reason they were trying to go with the 1 acre, to say that there are still options.
Yep.
Yep.
Not everything has to be these huge lots that are left.
Right, which I'm all in favor. I think it's a great thing to do in the right spots. That's all I'm suggesting. The one thing I'll say about that zone, so that's the neighborhood residential zone. I don't know that I would call it neighborhood necessarily. It's higher density residential, perhaps, whatever. But with options to allow 2-family and multifamily dwellings in appropriate locations. That's not a single-family zone any longer.
That's right. And we talked about this at a previous meeting, but it says on the periphery of the hamlet centers. You go from the hamlet centers on the periphery into nice residential communities. I don't think they want multifamily. I don't think they want 2-family.
Yeah, and there may be opportunities for those transitional areas in appropriate locations, but we should identify it. And zone
Identify
it
them
as a
now and
2-family zone or a
and let
multifamily
the
zone.
residents of that area know what it is.
Not for nothing, when you have these options, that's when it does affect property values.
Yeah.
Because you can make an argument is, I don't know what's gonna be built next to my single-family home. It could be a multifamily dwelling.
Yeah.
And to Mike's point, if the rules are, in order to meet the requirements, I can assemble properties, who knows what happens next door to you? Because your neighbor could buy his property and the next property and the next property, and all of a sudden you have enough land with the deducts of environmental properties to build a multifamily home.
So who gets to decide where those 2-family and multifamily and peripheries are if it's not specifically identified in
So I
here?
think there's criteria that's embedded in the zoning.
Yeah.
We'll get to that stuff
Okay.
further along, but I just want to look at the definitions first.
But it's the zoning board eventually?
No, it's you,
Does.
it's planning board. Most everything has been shifted to you.
Okay.
So my memo is gonna say, this is in this zone. It says that it may or may not, whatever it is, as I do now, it's allowed, it's not allowed. And then it's up to this board to make a determination at that time if this is the right spot for it.
It doesn't make sense for it to be in the planning board.
Again, it's uncertainty, so that's one of the things that's troubling. We want certainty in our plan. This is where we want stuff and not want stuff. When there is if, then, maybe, that gets tricky, and I guess flexibility is good in some instances, but we have to understand who's in charge of the flexibility and what are the limits of flexibility. And again, I'm not suggesting that Bonnie hasn't thought that through. I'm sure she has, but I want you to make sure you understand that as well. That's why I'm going at this from the other direction. So I see we're running out of steam, but let me just try to get through these real quick. Senior multifamily residential. One of the issues that you've heard all along is The only multifamily we had for years was senior multifamily. The zoning board clarified that, whether that decision was justifiable or not, who knows, but it was made. So we now have multifamily allowable in certain instances. But why are we still linking senior to multifamily? A senior housing project that's more than 3 units is a multifamily housing unit. You don't have to call it a senior housing project. So again, I think that's going back to one of our problem issues, and as opposed to starting fresh and just calling it all multifamily. Whether it's senior or market rate or limited in one way or another, who cares? It's a multifamily project that meets Mike's housing requirements.
Well, would
in the
you
state
have
building.
reason to put, say, no, we only want senior there, not multifamily?
So if this were a different community, the answer would be yes, because you're mitigating the impact on schools.
That's what I was just gonna say, yeah.
We have diminishing populations, we have lower school impacts, we don't have that
We
problem.
want
We
schools.
want school kids,
Yeah.
so we don't need zoning that
Yep.
encourages only people without kids to move in the community. Frankly, we want families with kids
Yeah.
to move into the community. So again, I don't know that it's a necessary provision in the
I
code.
think a school.
On the map, I think it's only the developed ones that are already built, though.
What's that, Mike?
I believe if you look at the map, what is senior multifamily, SMR, I think it's called?
It's
Yeah,
SMR.
I think those are the existing ones. I don't think it was any more.
Mr. Chairman, I think Mike's right. If you look at the one, I think that's mechanics or seminary. If you look at number 2, it's behind shop,
So
right?
that's
on
another
52.
good point. So Mike's right about that. And there's another provision in here, for example, it's the manufactured housing park
Yeah.
zone. That's not an aspirational land use we'd want, but we have them. So what this is doing is recognizing uses that are already there. Same thing with the senior housing that Mike just described.
So Pat, when we talk about senior housing, it's 55 and over, that's not assisted living, right?
No, that's a different use entirely, that's right, Vicki. So, but the point about this is, again, just another fundamental approach to our zoning. Those are existing uses. Whatever we do to our zoning, they're legally pre-existing uses. By maintaining the use, and I'll use the example of the multifamily housing, whether it was the intent of the town board to eliminate that use, they left that provision in the code. So the zoning board said it's in the code, somebody must have meant that it was supposed to happen in this community. By keeping it in the code, some smart lawyer down the road is gonna say, yeah, you want manufactured housing and trailer parks in your community, don't you? You have a provision for it. So I wanna add it to, I wanna expand it and put it over here. That's the slippery slope that worries me about these types of provisions of creating a zone for a use you don't want, but it's already there. So that's a philosophical question and how you deal with these things. The option is to just eliminate that. It's a legal pre-existing use, and ideally, you know, it goes away at some point in time.
And you could even list it as existing ones are allowed to remain, provided they were
Just
existing
eliminate
as of
it.
1982, or whatever the date is.
It doesn't do anything for our tax revenue, doesn't revitalize, doesn't. I
So,
would just
you know, a
delete it.
brand-new zoning, and the first thing that my eye jumps to is trailer parks.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what you want in the community. So again, sort of the approach. The hospital residential zone, this is one where they got it right. So there's a specific area, there's zoning that would be specific to the types of uses that can occur around the hospital. It's not a floating zone, it's not subjective, there it is, it's defined and it's right there.
Why do you do that for a hospital? Because of workers, because of what?
So clearly, that's a very different area of the town. Just look at it, and you understand it, look at the uses across the street, mixed uses, residential and commercial uses, the medical office buildings, it's a different area.
Because
It
it's there,
warrants
it's
its
like
own
this
zone.
now, right? There's houses, there's everything right there. The
To
barns
me,
across the, yeah.
it justifies its own zoning for itself, and it exists there and nowhere else in the community, so it should be its own zone. I think that's a perfect example of getting it right. Mixed-use Hamlet Center, so these, the next four, mixed-use Hamlet Center, that's the core of the hamlets. But think about this, and what I'd suggest before our next session is go up and down the corridors and see if you think there's a logical place to make these distinctions. Neighborhood business, corridor business, town commercial. So the town commercial is the shopping centers, that makes sense, but corridor business and neighborhood business, if you look at the map, they abut one another. And should it be one zone? Should it be these two zones? Is there a logical place for that break and those two different zones to exist? That's where the, rubber hits the road. But I'd really encourage you to look at that carefully. So John, you're looking at the map, so that's, I think you are. So keep it in your car when you drive around Route 6 and Route 52, and look at those interfaces and see if it makes sense. The way I always look at this, if you drive down the road and it changes, that's an interface. When you drive down the road, you can't tell where one thing changed and another changes, then what was the logic of creating the distinction between those two zones? So just bear that in mind when we think about this. Planned recreation destination, this is one of the controversial ones, which is suggested for some of the larger parcels that have been considered for other types of uses, commercial uses and other development opportunities. This is a very restrictive zone.
This is where the farm is, right? The old.
Yep, the Union Place property, which basically allows for open space development, nothing else to occur in there. We still have business park, we have planned mixed-use development, or overlay, and this is the overlay zones that we talked about before.
Can we go back to planned recreation
Yep.
destination?
Yep.
How do we think about this in terms of our tax base?
Yeah,
You know, if we want commercial and residential development, and I read elsewhere in here, we don't want to sacrifice commercial to residential, isn't this giving up a lot
it
for,
is.
for that?
Precise, you hit the nail on the head, Bob, it precisely is. So I don't think we have the opportunities to be overly restrictive. We're hurting in many ways, so we should be inviting rather than restricting in many ways. And when you have properties where there have been viable development proposals in the past that had marketing studies and demonstrated that they had sewer and water and access, limiting that is limiting that. So be aware, you know, by doing that, you are cutting off your nose to spite your face in some ways. You're just as you said, Bob, you're eliminating an opportunity.
Okay.
So just, again, the planning.
That
board
would be
needs
the
to
comment,
aware of
that would be the comment to the town.
Yep. And then we had the overlay zones that we talked about before, floating zones. It's, again, a philosophical approach. The issue with the floating zone is you're putting the burden on an applicant to come to you and ask for something. So now they have to do, it's extra money, it's extra expert, you have to hire experts to advance an application as opposed to just changing the zone. Do it now so that there isn't a petition that's required to change the zoning to accommodate their projects. So overlay zones, they have their place, there's no question about it, but it's an extra level of an applicant's obligation to make that happen. They're the ones that pull the trigger for us to think of whether or not that overlay zone should exist in a particular area. So again, it's just a philosophical approach to how you zone the town. And I think we just simply want to make sure the town board's aware that you're making it harder for an applicant to achieve those goals by making it an overlay zone.
And you're also increasing the likelihood of controversy because, you know, somebody who's in that zone counting on it to be zoned the way it is, all of a sudden wakes up one day and poof, the town is going to
That's exactly right.
do something
The
different.
benefit is there are curbs associated with it. So you created an overlay zone that has these certain provisions and parameters, as opposed to, let's go back to Union Place, where that was a proposal that just proposed a brand-new zone. There wasn't any provision that said it would be okay as long as the traffic did this, that, and the other thing. That applicant had to justify that. The floating zone, we do some of that justification, and if you can live within those parameters, the overlay zone is appropriate. But it's still, there's still subjectivity, and it's still, as I said, the applicant's burden to ask for it, which means you can say yes and you can say no. And a room full of people can influence a decision with respect to that, as opposed to an as-of-right use permitted in a zone where it's simply a big old P in the bottom.
But how would a floating zone work with a residential area? If somebody wants to come in and do a commercial development
So
and,
that's the point. So you would have to define where it could be generally acceptable, and you couldn't do it. You can just plop down a commercial district somewhere in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It would have to be within certain distance of Route 6 or within a certain distance of, you know, the courthouse in Mahopac
Yeah,
or Carmel
okay.
or something like that.
okay.
So again, I wanted you to get a handle on the use categories, and then let's look at the map next time and get, should these uses be in those locations? Should those boundaries be where they are? And if the answer is, I don't know, that's sufficient to let the town board know we couldn't figure it out.
We keep talking about having like, a taxpayer, what do we call it, taxpayer, type 3 structure with, glass on the bottom residential, and people living
Yep.
upstairs.
Yep.
Where do they want multi-people to move in? I mean, to Mike's point, if he's right, and I think he is, Mechanic Seminary behind ShopRite, Pulte's home, and then this one's the one from across the Olympic Diner. If that's the SMR that you're gonna put multiple people, where do they want all the people to come into and live?
Yeah,
It's not,
that's,
unless I'm wrong, you tell me.
no, you're right, it's,
All
I think
maps
it's,
I know is how to bomb stuff, so.
no, it's 4 or 5 areas. Yeah.
I think that's enough.
So that's all I wanted to get through.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Thanks.
So-
It's a lot of good work.
So what's on the agenda for the next one? In terms of,
This,
yeah,
so we want to go through the map itself.
just the map,
Yeah,
not
so
the
we'll sit
zoning
around the
code yet?
table and look at the
Okay.
map.
That's it. That's all over.
Pat, thank you for the review.
That's it.
Very good.
So I'm keeping notes, and again, this is all going to get turned into your memo, and you can.
No, this is terrific. This is a good session. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Good night, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.